So the other day, I was running an errand at Target, and I came around the corner and I saw this. And, in case you can't read it, this is the wearable technology aisle. I was really struck by seeing this and realizing that when there is a wearable technology aisle at Target, you know that self-tracking tools have really entered the mainstream of American culture. And what I want to talk about today is how wearables will get into medical school. So I want to go a little bit back to the future here. I couldn't resist with this one. I want to think about how to bring the mobile, social, connected, digital health revolution into the training of doctors by looking at a few examples from history of moments when there were new technologies that, at the time that they came out, seemed to really promise a radical new future. Then, as now, these sorts of innovations were met with deep ambivalence by medical organizations, but some of them did make it into medical school, and I think we can learn a lot by looking at how that happened. So our first example is the X-ray. We're going way back in time here. So Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895. This is the first X-ray that was ever made of his wife's hand. And it was really an incredible discovery for a number of reasons. For one, X-rays allowed us for the first time ever to see inside of a living human body without cutting it open. And in this era, cutting open a human body was incredibly risky in terms of infection and mortality and everything else. So this not only opened up a whole new realm of vision, but it really transformed the ways that doctors saw the body, the ways that they saw health and disease. And it opened up all kinds of innovations in medicine going forward. Second thing about X-rays that's interesting is that they were an open technology. Röntgen deliberately refused to seek patents on the discovery because he said he wanted all of humanity to benefit from them. But the third thing about X-rays is that even though they started being used in surgery within weeks of their discovery, it actually took about 20 years for them to be fully integrated into medical practice in American hospitals. So why? Is this one of these examples of the famed 17-year lag of new technologies being adopted into medical practice and medical education? Well, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. There were a few things that prevented X-rays from becoming immediately embraced by organized medicine. One was that there was a lot of debate about what they actually showed. Doctors did not agree amongst themselves about what you saw in early X-rays. And with that much kind of unsettled knowledge about what this device actually showed, people were uncomfortable with just bringing it into the clinic. And this was partly because this was a disruptive mode of seeing. It transformed how doctors saw the human body, and because of that, it required behavior change. And I think, as many of us know, behavior change is not easy. The other reason that there was a lag in the adoption of X-rays was because it was not clear who owned them. Remember, it was an open technology, and doctors had never used anything like this in medical practice before. But there was a profession that did use something like this, and that was photographers. Actually, taking an X-ray and taking a photograph were very similar, and in this period, people didn't just have consumer-grade handheld cameras. If you wanted a picture taken, you had to go to a professional photographer's studio and sit for a portrait. In the early days of X-rays, you could also sit for an X-ray portrait at a studio. And not only that, but then you could leave the photographer's studio and go down the street to the shoe store and get your feet X-rayed to make sure that you were wearing scientifically appropriate shoes. So it was not at all clear who owned this technology. So in order to really claim X-rays as medical imaging technologies, American medicine, and especially the American Medical Association, really had to kind of launch a campaign to shut out the photographers and the shoe salesmen from claiming ownership of this technology. And I must say that they probably would not have been successful on their own, but they found a really good industry partner, and that made a crucial difference. So a guy by the name of Thomas Edison, who you've probably heard of, had this fledgling light bulb startup, became known as General Electric. And in this era, General Electric was totally transforming the ways that people understood what modern life was. They were developing the electrical power industry as we now know it. They were doing things like teaching people how to turn on lights without matches. They were making telephones more widely available to people, and they were making X-rays as medical tools. So when General Electric got into the medical device manufacturing business, they reframed X-rays as part of modern life, and therefore as part of a modern hospital. And then they started to make a little bit more sense. And so when you think about this kind of contextualization, I think it's really important to note it wasn't about technical aspects of the X-ray itself. It was about the human uses of the technology. It was about the context in which people used these things and made sense of them. And once there was a coherent framework for thinking about that, people were much better able to actually use these technologies, and they became embraced by medical organizations and medical schools. So, in 1895 and years thereafter, X-rays really transformed the ways that doctors saw the human body. X-rays made medicine visual. And from that point forward, doctors had to be able to consume images intelligently in order to practice good clinical medicine. So this was really transforming how the body was seen and understood, but back at medical school, this is how people were learning how to perform surgery. They were cramming into these crowded amphitheaters. They would have to crane their necks to get a view of what was going on. Once it happened, it was over. They could never review it. They could never slow it down, go back and study it again. It was over, and a lot of people thought that this was just increasingly just not a good model for teaching. So although X-rays were changing clinical medicine, medical education was stuck in this 16th century model of the surgical amphitheater. So this guy came along and he said, well, how about using movies to get medical education up to speed? This was Dr. Rudolf Mattes, who's a well-known innovator in surgery and anesthesia, and he proposed in a lecture in 1912 with this somewhat unwieldy title that American doctors should produce what he called a complete cinematographic course, where all of the important medical procedures that any doctor would need to learn would be filmed and then presented to doctors, and they could view them as many times as they needed to. They could slow them down. They could access them in lots of different locations, and this would be the solution to some of the medical education problems that, that people were seeing in the wet clinic model. But surprisingly, perhaps, doctors, American doctors overall were not on board with this model. So again, why not? Well, for one thing, the surgical amphitheater model had been around since the 16th century, and it was a time-honored tradition, and people respected it and valued it and didn't see any reason to change. So there was a bit of inertia there. But the other thing that happened was that surgeons like Eugene Louis Doyen, who was in Paris, had been using films since they were available to film his own surgeries, much like athletes now film their own performances and then review them to try to improve their performance and make it better and faster and stronger. He was reviewing his surgeries to try to make them more efficient, shorter, and therefore safer for patients. So he was making these films for himself, for his own training, for his team, and also for other doctors. But something that happened with one of his films, which was an attempt at separating conjoined twins, was that this film got out of the clinical setting. It escaped from the intended context, and instead it started circulating in places like sideshows, vaudeville shows. It became, instead of a tool of medical education, a tool of exploitation. And this was, even though medical ethics were not very evolved in this era, this was still clearly very problematic as an ethical issue. It was damaging for patients, and it was damaging for the image of medicine in the public, so nobody wanted to embark on this kind of a path. So it wasn't until 14 years later, when Dr. Mattes became president of the American College of Surgeons, that he organized a new approach to using motion pictures in medical education. He also set up a collaboration with George Eastman of Eastman Kodak and Will Hayes, the head of the Hollywood Trade Industry Organization, and proposed to them, and they agreed to make a series of medical motion pictures, kind of like what he had proposed many years earlier. And because this team covered academic and industry and technical expertise, they really had all of the right components to make a really strong series of films that were then used in medical education. This is an example of one of them from 1929. So the collaboration between these different groups was really important to the success of this endeavor, but the other thing that was important to it was the quality of the films themselves. They used really sophisticated, especially for their era, sophisticated animation techniques, and importantly, they showed things that you could not see in the surgical amphitheater. Just like X-rays, they showed things that you could not see with the naked eye. They introduced a new way of seeing that was incredibly powerful and that allowed doctors to do what they needed to do better. The final reason that motion pictures then became embraced by medical education was that doctors started using them in their personal lives. They started making home movies. And it turns out that doctors have often been early adopters of new technologies. And when that happens, those technologies clear the social hurdles that can often make it difficult for them to get into standard medical practice much more quickly because they already make sense within the context that they're being used in. So when doctors started making movies and medical films became a kind of participatory medicine for doctors, they really took off. Now, a lot of the debates around online education that we're having today echo the concerns about using movies in medical education from the earlier part of the 20th century. And by and large, medical schools have not been very quick to embrace digital platforms for learning that have been experimented with in many other sectors in these days. But I want to suggest that it's possible that these new platforms for learning, just like the earlier motion pictures, will not necessarily destroy the human connection that people were worried motion pictures might destroy, and instead might open up an opportunity for a new kind of participatory medicine. And that brings us to our final example. So one of the things that movies did was they did a really good job of providing high-quality visuals of things that no one had seen before asynchronously. So you could see them anytime, not just at the time that they actually occurred. Our final example, closed-circuit television, provided synchronous live communication. And it did that between an operating room, say, and a classroom or an auditorium. So in the post-World War II era, TV seemed to provide certain things that movies could not. The liveness that they offered really seemed to captivate medical students who often said that they loved the intimacy and the immediacy that this kind of experience seemed to provide. And in this quote by Marshall McLuhan here, you can see that there was this sense of closed-circuit television almost providing a kind of virtual reality experience, a real enhancement of perception that seemed to be very powerful and desirable as an educational experience. But the problem was, even though there was this capacity for phone-in questions to the doctors that were performing the surgeries while they were performing them, still, this was a very one-way centralized command model. It was a broadcast model where the source is in one place and it pushes out the information and the content to the recipients, and it was so technologically intensive in its infrastructure, the doctors couldn't do this on their own. So it was a very rigid model, and as a result, it didn't really take off. But the thing that's interesting about closed-circuit television is that although it wasn't really embraced as an educational tool, and in fact, instead it became a tool of surveillance mainly, it's something that still very much captivates us and that we're still chasing. And I would suggest that the experiments with Google Glass and with Skype in medical settings and in medical education are really trying to capture this sort of live, two-way or multi-way continuous visual imaging that closed-circuit television was seeking in an earlier era. And I would say that for the current era of participatory medicine, the real challenge is going to be not just creating continuous, live, dynamic, two-way conversations and communication, but making sure that any point in this communication can be the origin of communication and that patients can be one of those points of control. Thank you.
We'll have time for questions.
A question about how this fits in with modifying the recruitment of medical student profiles. There's been a lot of information about changing the basis on which medical students are selected to make it more towards humanities and personal interviews rather than so science-oriented. So that would make a big difference, I would think, in using these tools and wanting to use them.
Do you mean because, what, can you say more? I'm not sure I understand the
what
question.
I'm saying is that if you're introducing these new tools destined to improve two-way communication, they're going to be much better applied by people who come there hoping for such tools versus those who don't. So doesn't this have to go hand in hand with changing the recruitment policies for medical students, as I've been reading about some various schools?
Yes, it could, although I will also say, and I think Warren's talk spoke to this a little bit too, that there is also a kind of attractiveness of these technologies often that can then do its own recruiting, so that this is in some ways a perhaps counterintuitive model for teaching better communication skills and eliciting a deeper kind of engagement, because students who may not necessarily be driven by a strong, say, humanist desire to have that kind of deep communication might nonetheless be attracted to using these tools, and so they might end up gaining those skills and developing that capability anyway.
I'm monopolizing, but I'm so interested by what all you have to say, I actually have a question. So when you use technology, I'll put it this way. I have a friend who makes video games, and often he's surprised by, his video games are very popular, and often he's surprised by what people find. And they find little bugs and little avenues that they think he created, but he had nothing to do with it. And he's often surprised at what people find in his work that he didn't know existed. And I guess my question is, in regards to technologies that are emerging for medical school, it's a two-way street. It's the creator of the technology and the intended use. And then it's the user of the technology and the use that they bring to it. And that use, as I've seen from millennials, which I love talking about millennials, but they find the most arcane usages and unorthodox usages for the technology you give them with an intended purpose. I guess my question is, can you comment on that? Like,
Yeah, that is, it's always the case that whoever creates the technology cannot control what end users are going to do with it. And in fact, you know, it's an argument for getting users involved in the design and also for creating as nimble a technology as possible. That's one of the reasons closed circuit television didn't work, was because it was so kind of clunky and so technology intensive that if it needed to change, it couldn't. But because this is something that always happens, even if it's not about actually changing the technology, the meaning that someone might find in a film or in an iPad app or just an image on a screen cannot be 100% controlled. So it's not a good use of energy to actually try to control for that. It's a good use of energy to design so that the usefulness of the tool can be augmented and adapt to that.
Are there any interfaces that exist for collaboration in that, so that the user I don't know much about you know, the use of technology in medical school. I guess that dates me, but is there any usage? Is there any interface where somebody using the technology in the context of medical education can go back to the creator and say, hey, I'm using it for this. Maybe you can expand upon that avenue, or does that not exist? Or
well, it depends on the technology. I mean, one of the interesting things about participatory media in the era we live in is that app creation can be very dynamic. You can go back and revise, and so in some ways doing an experiment like what Warren was talking about allows for a much more intimate kind of interplay between the end users and the creators, because they're all kind of engaged in this process together. If you're talking about, say, again, GE still makes medical imaging devices, and you know, if you have feedback about the CT scanner, it's probably not going to get tweaked in exactly that way. But at the same time, you know, large corporations are also very invested in hearing from their users, so they seek that out as well. It's just a sort of slower iterative process, I would say.
I'm an anesthesiologist. I hope people don't have feedback when they're supposed to not have feedback.
That's a good point.
Any other questions? I'm sorry I monopolized the time. Dr. Ostherr, this has been outstanding.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.